Let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really compelling case study that digs into the psychological mechanics of how a justice system and an individual can just completely and fundamentally fail to understand each other. This isn't just about the law, it's really about the cognitive structures that dictate exactly how we perceive truth, threat, and reality itself.
Because what actually happens when a highly complex mind collides with a rigid system? That question is at the absolute heart of the Dr. Chen Jingyuan case. It's a fascinating scenario where, according to the case study, a scholar's rational, highly complex search for truth was legally classified by a justice system as a malicious crime. How does a translation failure of that magnitude even happen?
Well, that brings us to Section 1, the psychological paradox. This is really a clash of minds, not just facts.
To truly wrap our heads around this case, we have to look way past the legal jargon and the courtroom drama. We need to examine this as a profound psychological mismatch. Here are the basics. Dr. Chen is a highly educated scholar who suddenly found himself facing serious legal charges, specifically picking quarrels and provoking trouble. In his offense, he literally just forwarded an academic article on complex network theory from overseas on social media. That's it. But that single act triggered a massive institutional response, even though he had a tiny follower count and caused absolutely zero social disruption.
The research highlights a really stark paradox here between the action and the charge. Think about it. You have the action itself, an academic sharing complex network theory and exploring ideas. And then you have the system's charge, which categorizes that intellectual exploration as a deliberate, malicious attempt to cause chaos and threaten societal stability. It's a total disconnect.
Let's look at Section 2, the scholar's mind. We're talking about high complexity and post-formal thinking.
We really need to understand how Dr. Chen's mind operates, especially when put under the extreme pressure of the criminal justice system. You see, Dr. Chen processes the world through a highly complex lens. Psychologists actually call this post-formal thinking. Basically, he doesn't rely on simple binary judgments of right and wrong. Instead, he uses advanced mathematical and philosophical frameworks to make sense of societal events. He's integrating things like the IKP theorem from computer science, or Gödel's incompleteness theorem, which essentially says that some truths just cannot be neatly proven within a closed system. Plus, he maintains a super strong internal locus of control. He relies on his own rigorous logic rather than just bowing down to external authority.
When you're incarcerated and totally cut off from the world, it's pretty normal to expect a person to just break. But Dr. Chen? He leaned hard into Viktor Frankl's concept of logotherapy. Remember Frankl's idea that humans can endure any how as long as they know the why? Well, Dr. Chen didn't emotionally collapse in prison. Instead, he engaged in this deep meaning-making. He maintained his dignity and his sanity by turning his own suffering into an intellectual and philosophical project.
So the crucial takeaway here is that his response to trauma was a textbook example of a really mature psychological defense mechanism called sublimation. Instead of writing some desperate plea for mercy or giving a false confession just to make it stop, he wrote what the case actually refers to as a blood letter. Now, not literal blood, but a massive, meticulously documented theoretical defense, all written under immense, grueling institutional pressure. He essentially reconstructed his reality through science and achieved what psychologists call post-traumatic growth.
Moving on to Section 3, the system's mind and institutional defensive psychology.
All right, let's contrast the scholar's mind by looking at the psychological operating system of the institution itself, the police, the prosecutors, the judges. The analysis argues that once the system anchored onto a threat narrative for Dr. Chen, they exhibited extreme confirmation bias. They systematically searched for, interpreted, and favored any tiny detail that supported their pre-existing belief. At the same time, they completely ignored what the defense presented as clear evidence of harmless intent or even mathematical proofs of zero societal impact.
Furthermore, the case study suggests that these prosecutors and judges engaged in what's known as system justification. Basically, through motivated reasoning, they convinced themselves that defending the status quo, even if it meant bending procedural rules or ignoring hard scientific evidence, was actually a necessary sacrifice for the greater good of social stability. They rationalized their actions just to maintain their own psychological equilibrium.
And operating within a high-pressure, closed community, these judicial actors inevitably succumb to groupthink. When everyone around you shares the exact same threat-sensitive perspective, you get a serious diffusion of responsibility. No single individual feels morally culpable for a completely flawed verdict because, hey, they're all just following procedure. What's fascinating is how this clash of processing styles maps perfectly onto Daniel Kahneman's dual systems theory. You have the scholar operating in System 2, which is slow, analytical, highly focused on structural causes, and has a high tolerance for ambiguity. Then you have the institution operating in System 1, fast, intuitive, hyper-focused on individual intent with practically zero tolerance for ambiguity. It is just a complete fundamental mismatch. But it's really important we view this objectively. The judicial actors aren't acting out of some cartoonish malice. They are adapting to a heavily pressurized, threat-driven environment. It's a system with strict accountability and extreme risk aversion. It demands quick, binary classifications of risk and has a punitive reward mechanism for institutional errors. Basically, their psychology is just a product of their ecosystem. Which leads us perfectly into Section 4, the cognitive collision, an inevitable psychological mismatch. So what actually happens when these two completely incompatible psychological worlds are forced to interact in a single courtroom? Well, you get a total collapse of meaning. Where the scholar's framework was built on knowledge, skepticism, and complexity, the systems framework was built entirely on risk, control, and binary rules. Where Dr. Chen embraced nuance, the justice system demanded absolute certainty.
The resulting translation failure is just incredible to look at. Literally every single action Dr. Chen took to explain his reality was psychologically recoded by the system. When he expressed skepticism seeking the truth, the system interpreted it as subjective malice. His complex scientific defense? To him, it was epistemological humility. To the system, it was just stubborn sophistry and a refusal to confess. Even his refusal to give a false confession was just coded as a bad attitude and disobedience.
At a really foundational level, the system is completely hardwired for intent attribution. It desperately needs to find a culprit with malicious intent to close a case. But the scholar is wired for structural attribution. He's looking at multi-layered environmental causes for how information actually spreads. Now, to be fair, humans are actually evolutionarily biased toward intent attribution. We survived by quickly identifying a predator with malicious intent, right? Not by structurally analyzing the wind in the grass. But in this case, they were quite literally speaking entirely different psychological languages, which made a fair trial pretty much impossible.
And that brings us to our final part, Section 5, Systemic Misjudgment and the Mechanics of a Flawed Verdict.
Let's look at the final outcome and see how this cognitive mismatch practically guarantees a systemic misjudgment. According to the analysis, without any concrete evidence of actual harm, the system relied entirely on a heuristic processing path. They perceived a threat, they anchored Dr. Chen to the label of a troublemaker, they sought out confirming evidence, and then they just diffused the responsibility. They basically leaned on the stereotype that a highly educated person should have known better, entirely bypassing empirical evidence for easy cognitive shortcuts.
And here's where it gets even more tragic. During his defense, Dr. Chen's attempts to use probabilistic models to prove his actions were mathematically harmless, that only alienated the court further. Because when experts speak in probabilities, institutions hear an evasion of responsibility. A system that is absolutely desperate for definitive, linear cause and effect is going to view the language of scientific uncertainty as totally evasive.
The source actually frames the ultimate refusal to let Dr. Chen properly defend himself in court as an extreme act of cognitive closure and dehumanization. By aggressively silencing him and shutting out all that complex data that threatened their simplified, pre-written narrative, the system effectively just stripped the scholar of his voice.
Ultimately, the analysis presents this case study as a pretty profound tragedy of institutional limits. It's a clash between evolving individual metacognition and a defensive collective psyche. It frames the whole situation as a highly integrated, self-actualized mind being punished simply because the surrounding institution lacked the psychological maturity and, really, the tolerance for ambiguity to even comprehend it.
Which leaves us with this powerful quote. When a system cannot understand a mind more complex than its own, it imposes its own psychological structure upon it. It really makes us ask the big question, does our current justice system actually possess the psychological capacity to evaluate complex truths, or is it merely designed to protect itself from the unknown? Definitely something to chew on the next time you see a clash between an individual and a massive institution. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning everything.